The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital flickered as Grace Montgomery pushed through the emergency room doors at 6:47 a.m., her nurse's scrubs still crisp and her coffee untouched in her hand. She had exactly 13 minutes before her shift started, which was cutting it close even by her standards. Grace prided herself on punctuality. 23 years old, 3 years into her nursing career, and she'd never been late, not once. But as she rounded the corner toward the staff locker room, she nearly collided with a woman stumbling through the entrance, her face pale as moonlight, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping the doorframe for support. "Please!" the woman gasped, her accent thick and unfamiliar. "Please, I need help." Grace dropped her coffee without hesitation, the brown liquid spreading across the linoleum as she caught the woman before she collapsed. Up close, Grace could see she was young, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her clothes were threadbare, and she wore no coat despite the bitter February wind that had followed her inside. "I've got you," Grace said firmly, guiding her toward a wheelchair near the reception desk. "How far along are you?" 8 months, the woman whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe more. I don't know exactly. I have no papers, no insurance. They told me at the clinic downtown I need to pay first, but I have nothing. Nothing, and something is wrong. The pain. It's not supposed to be like this." Grace's training kicked in immediately. She could see the signs, the way the woman held herself, the irregular breathing, the sheen of perspiration that spoke of more than just exertion. This wasn't normal labor. This was something more serious. "What's your name?" Grace asked, already wheeling her toward triage. "Lucia," the woman managed between sharp breaths. "Lucia Reyes." The triage nurse Patricia looked up from her computer and caught Grace's eye. In that glance, Grace saw the same assessment she'd made. This woman needed immediate attention. But Patricia's expression shifted as she glanced at the clock, then back at Grace with a meaningful look. The morning shift supervisor, Margaret Henderson, was notoriously strict about protocol. No insurance meant paperwork delays, and someone would have to advocate for Lucia through the bureaucratic maze. "I'll take her," Grace heard herself say, even as her mind calculated what this meant. Her shift was supposed to start in 9 minutes. Margaret would be waiting, clipboard in hand, ready to assign the day's duties. Patricia nodded slowly. "Room 7 is open. I'll page Dr. Whitmore." Grace wheeled Lucia down the corridor, her own shift start time ticking away. Through the small window in Room 7's door, she could see Margaret in the hallway, checking her watch, scanning for her team. Grace made a split-second decision and closed the door, focusing entirely on Lucia. "Tell me about the pain," Grace said gently, helping Lucia onto the examination bed. "Where is it? When did it start?" Lucia's story emerged in fragments, interrupted by contractions that made her cry out. She'd come to the country 6 months ago, fleeing violence in her hometown. The baby's father was gone, lost to the same violence that had driven her north. She'd been working cash jobs, cleaning offices at night, living in a shelter. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks, but yesterday the pain had started, different from the practice contractions she'd felt before. Sharp, persistent, terrifying. As Grace examined her, checking vital signs and monitoring the baby's heartbeat, a cold realization settled over her. The baby was in distress. Lucia was showing signs of placental abruption, a condition where the placenta separates from the uterine wall before delivery. It was serious. It could be fatal for both mother and child, if not treated immediately. Dr. Whitmore arrived, a silver-haired woman with keen eyes and steady hands. She took one look at Grace's face and understood the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, they had Lucia prepped for emergency surgery. The baby couldn't wait. "I'm scared," Lucia whispered, gripping Grace's hand so tightly it hurt. "I'm alone. I have no one." "You're not alone," Grace said, squeezing back. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." But even as she spoke those words, Grace heard her name being called over the intercom. "Grace Montgomery, please report to the nurses' station immediately." Grace Montgomery. It was Margaret's voice, clipped and irritated. Grace was officially late, officially missing her shift assignment, officially in violation of the hospital's attendance policy. In the 3 months since Margaret had taken over as supervisor, she'd terminated 2 nurses for attendance issues. The woman ran the floor like a military operation, and Grace knew that missing a shift without prior approval was grounds for serious disciplinary action, possibly even termination. Grace looked down at Lucia, whose eyes were wide with fear and pain, And then at the door beyond which her career hung in the balance. She'd worked so hard to get here. Nursing school had nearly broken her, financially and emotionally. She'd taken on massive student debt, worked 3 jobs simultaneously, sacrificed relationships and sleep and any semblance of a normal young adult life. This job was everything. It was her identity, her purpose, her future. But it was also about this, holding the hand of a terrified young woman who had no one else. "I'm staying," Grace said quietly, more to herself than to Lucia. She pulled up a stool beside the bed. "They're going to take such good care of you. Your baby is going to be fine." The intercom crackled again. "Grace Montgomery, final call." Dr. Whitmore caught Grace's eye, a question in her gaze. Grace could leave now, explain the situation to Margaret, possibly salvage her position. But Lucia's grip tightened, and Grace knew she couldn't walk away. The surgery took 2 hours. Grace stayed through all of it, standing beside the operating table in borrowed scrubs, holding Lucia's hand as the anesthesia took effect, whispering reassurances in broken Spanish she'd picked up from her college roommate. When the baby, a tiny, perfect boy, emerged with a strong, indignant cry, Grace felt tears streaming down her own face. "You have a son," she told Lucia in recovery. "He's beautiful, he's healthy. You did it." Lucia wept, reaching for the small bundle the nurses placed in her arms. "I want to name him Gabriel," she whispered. "It means God's messenger, because you were sent to me. You saved us." Grace stayed until Lucia was stable, until Gabriel had nursed for the first time, until mother and baby were sleeping peacefully in the postpartum wing. Only then did she trudge to Margaret's office, her body exhausted, her mind preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Margaret's expression was ice. "You missed your entire shift. No call, no explanation, no response to pages. You know the policy, Grace." "I know," Grace said quietly. "There was a patient." "There are always patients," Margaret interrupted. "That's not an excuse. You're suspended pending review, 2 weeks, unpaid. If you want to keep your job, you'll need to meet with the disciplinary board next Monday and provide a compelling reason why we shouldn't terminate your employment." Grace felt the words like physical blows. 2 weeks without pay meant she couldn't make rent. The disciplinary board was notoriously harsh, but as she walked out of the hospital that afternoon, the winter sun bright against the dirty snow, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. What Grace didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that someone had been watching the entire episode unfold, someone whose opinion would change everything. Grace spent the first 3 days of her suspension in a haze of anxiety and calculations. Her apartment rent was due in 10 days, and her bank account held exactly $843. Rent was $1,200. She had student loan payments, utilities, her car insurance. The math didn't work, no matter how many times she rearranged the numbers on the notepad beside her bed. On the 4th day, she returned to the hospital, not to work, but to check on Lucia and Gabriel. She'd been thinking about them constantly, wondering if they were okay, if Lucia had anywhere to go when she was discharged. Grace had half expected security to stop her at the entrance, but her badge still worked for visitor access, and she made her way to the postpartum floor without incident. She found Lucia sitting up in bed, Gabriel sleeping peacefully in her arms. The young mother's face lit up when she saw Grace. "You came back," Lucia said, her English a little stronger now, more confident. "I was hoping you would. The nurses told me what happened, that you were suspended because of me, not because of you," Grace corrected gently, pulling up a chair. "Because of my choice, and I'd make it again." They talked for over an hour. Lucia shared more of her story, how she'd crossed the border with a group of other refugees, how they'd been separated, how she'd ended up in the city with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to give her child a better life. Grace listened, her heart aching for this brave young woman who'd endured so much. "The social worker came by yesterday," Lucia said, her voice dropping. "She found me a place at a shelter for mothers and babies. It's only temporary, maybe 3 months, but it's something. And there are people there who can help me figure out the immigration paperwork, maybe find real work." She paused, looking down at Gabriel. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did." "You don't have to thank me," Grace said. "Just take care of that beautiful boy." As she left the hospital that afternoon, Grace felt marginally better. At least her decision had resulted in something good, something that mattered. But the anxiety about her own situation crept back in as she drove home through the grey city streets. That evening, her phone rang with an unknown number. Grace almost didn't answer, probably a spam call, but something made her pick up. "Is this Grace Montgomery?" a woman's voice asked, professional and crisp. "Yes, this is Grace. Miss Montgomery, my name is Jennifer Cole. I'm calling from Hartman Industries. Mr. Hartman would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock if you're available." Grace's mind went blank. Hartman Industries. She knew the name, everyone in the city did. It was one of the largest private corporations in the country, a conglomerate with interests in everything from real estate to healthcare to technology. But why would they want to meet with her? "I'm sorry," Grace said slowly. "I think you might have the wrong person. I'm a nurse. I don't have any connection to Hartman Industries." "We have the right person," Jennifer assured her. "Mr. Hartman specifically requested this meeting. Can we expect you tomorrow at 10? The address is 1500 Commerce Street, 42nd floor. Grace's apartment was a mess. She had nothing appropriate to wear to a meeting at one of the city's most prestigious companies. But curiosity, and a desperate hope that this might somehow help her financial situation, made her agree. "I'll be there," she said. She stayed up half the night researching Hartman Industries and its founder, Richard Hartman. The man was a legend in business circles. 56 years old, self-made billionaire, known for his sharp mind and sharper business practices. He'd built his empire from nothing, starting with a single apartment building in his 20s and expanding into a vast network of holdings. He was also notoriously private, rarely giving interviews, never married, no children that anyone knew of. But why would he want to meet with her? The next morning, Grace put on her only professional outfit, a navy dress she'd worn to her nursing school graduation, and took the bus downtown. The Hartman Industries building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, dominating the skyline. The lobby alone was larger than Grace's entire apartment, all marble floors and modern art. Jennifer Cole met her at the reception desk, a woman in her 40s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a tailored suit that probably cost more than Grace made in a month. "Miss Montgomery, right this way." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt interminable. Grace's palms were sweating. Jennifer made polite small talk about the weather, but Grace could barely focus enough to respond. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped into an executive suite that looked like something from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive furniture, an atmosphere of quiet power. "Mr. Hartman, we'll see you now," Jennifer said, opening a heavy wooden door. The office beyond was massive, and behind an enormous desk sat a man who looked nothing like the stern, cold businessman Grace had imagined. Richard Hartman was tall, probably 6'2", with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, and when he stood to greet her, Grace was struck by the intensity of his presence. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice deep and measured, "thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Grace sat, her heart pounding. Richard Hartman returned to his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I imagine you're confused about why you're here," he began. "Very confused," Grace admitted. A slight smile touched his lips. "4 days ago, you helped a young woman named Lucia Reyes. You stayed with her through an emergency surgery, missing your shift, ultimately getting suspended from your job. Is that correct?" Grace's throat went dry. "How do you know about that?" "Because," Richard said quietly, "Lucia Reyes is my half-sister." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You're... what?" Richard stood walking to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "My father wasn't a good man, Miss Montgomery. He abandoned my mother when I was 5 years old. I didn't know until recently that he'd gone to Mexico, started another family. Lucia's mother reached out to me 6 months ago before she died, telling me about Lucia, about the danger she was in. I've been trying to find her ever since." His voice tightened with emotion. "I hired investigators, checked every shelter, every hospital, and then, 4 days ago, my people finally located her at St. Mary's. By the time I got there, she was already in recovery. The nurses told me what happened. They told me about you." Grace couldn't speak. The pieces were falling into place in a way that seemed impossible. "I went to the security office," Richard continued, turning back to face her. "I asked to see the footage from that morning. I watched you catch her when she came through the doors. I watched you make the choice to stay with her, knowing what it would cost you." He paused, his blue eyes intense. "Do you know how rare that is, Miss Montgomery? True selflessness. I've spent 30 years in business, and I can count on one hand the number of people I've met who would sacrifice their own interests for a stranger." She needed help, Grace said simply. Anyone would have done the same. No, Richard said firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have directed her to the registration desk and moved on with their day. You stayed. You held her hand. You were there for the birth of my nephew. His expression softened. Lucia told me she wants to name him Gabriel. She said you were like an angel sent to help her. Grace felt tears pricking her eyes. Is she okay? And the baby? They're both doing well. I've moved them to a private recovery suite, and I've arranged for the best postnatal care available. I'm also working with immigration attorneys to secure Lucia's status here permanently. He returned to his desk, sitting down and folding his hands. But that's not why I asked you here. I want to offer you a position. Grace blinked. A position? Hartman Industries has recently acquired controlling interest in St. Mary's Hospital, along with 4 other medical facilities in the region. I'm restructuring the management, and I need someone to oversee patient care advocacy across all 5 locations. Someone who understands what healthcare should be about. Someone who puts patients first. He leaned forward. I want that person to be you. Grace felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. She stared at Richard Hartman, trying to process what he'd just said. A position overseeing patient care advocacy across 5 hospitals. Her. She was a 23-year-old nurse with 3 years of experience and a suspension on her record. Mr. Hartman, she began carefully, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified for that kind of role. I don't have management experience, I don't have an advanced degree, and right now I'm facing a disciplinary board that might terminate my nursing license entirely. You won't be facing that board, Richard said matter-of-factly. As of yesterday, Margaret Henderson is no longer employed at St. Mary's. The interim supervisor has already cleared your record. You're welcome to return to your nursing position if you prefer, but I hope you'll consider my offer instead. Grace's head spun. You fired Margaret because of me. I fired Margaret because I reviewed her personnel files and discovered a pattern of prioritizing bureaucracy over patient welfare. Your situation was simply the catalyst that brought it to my attention. He opened a folder on his desk. The position I'm offering comes with a salary of $120,000 annually, full benefits, and a staff to support you. You'd be developing protocols, training programs, and acting as a patient advocate at the executive level. It's not a traditional management role. I'm not asking you to push papers. I'm asking you to do what you did for Lucia, but on a larger scale. To be the voice for patients who might otherwise be overlooked. $120,000. Grace made $38,000 as a nurse. The number was so staggering, she couldn't quite grasp it. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You could hire someone with years of experience, someone with credentials. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. Credentials don't mean much to me, Miss Montgomery. I built my first company without a college degree. What matters is character, and you've already shown me yours, but if you need time to think about it, I'll do it, Grace heard herself say. The words came out before her rational mind could stop them, but once they were spoken, she felt a surge of certainty. This was why she'd become a nurse in the first place, to help people, to make a difference. This position would let her do that on a scale she'd never imagined possible. Richard's expression warmed, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Excellent. Jennifer will have the contracts ready by tomorrow. In the meantime, I'd like you to visit Lucia again. She's been asking about you. As Grace stood to leave, her legs still shaky, Richard spoke again. Miss Montgomery, Grace, if I may, there's something else you should know. I watched that security footage more than once. I saw the moment you made your decision, the moment you chose to stay with Lucia despite knowing the consequences. That kind of moral courage is extraordinarily rare. He paused. My father was a coward who ran from his responsibilities. You're the opposite of him. I want people like you in my organization. Grace left the building in a daze. On the bus ride back to her apartment, she kept expecting to wake up to realize this had all been some stress-induced dream. But when she checked her phone, there was already an email from Jennifer Cole with preliminary paperwork and a start date 2 weeks away. She went directly to St. Mary's, to the private suite where Richard had moved Lucia. The room was nothing like the standard postpartum accommodations. It was more like a hotel suite, with comfortable furniture, soft lighting, and a peaceful atmosphere. Lucia was sitting in a rocking chair, Gabriel at her breast, and when she saw Grace, her face broke into a radiant smile. They told me, she said. They told me what Richard offered you. Grace, this is wonderful. I can't believe any of this is real, Grace admitted, pulling up a chair beside her. "A week ago I was just trying to get through my shift. Now you've changed 2 lives," Lucia said softly. "3, if you count Richard. He came to see us yesterday, and Grace," he cried when he held Gabriel. "He said he never thought he'd have family, that he'd accepted being alone. But now he has us, and it's because you brought us together." Over the next hour, Lucia shared what she'd learned about Richard, how he'd been obsessed with finding her ever since her mother's letter arrived, how he'd blamed himself for not knowing about her sooner, for not being there when she needed help. How holding Gabriel had broken something open in him, some wall he'd built around his heart. "He's not what people think," Lucia said. "Everyone sees the powerful businessman, but I see someone who's lonely, someone who's spent his whole life building an empire, but has no one to share it with." Grace thought about Richard's office, so perfect and impersonal. She thought about the intensity in his eyes when he talked about watching the security footage, about finding her. There had been something more than professional respect in his gaze, something that had made her pulse quicken, in a way that had nothing to do with the job offer. She pushed the thought away. Richard Hartman was a billionaire, a man who operated in a completely different world. The job offer was generous enough. She couldn't let herself imagine there might be anything more. But over the following weeks, as Grace started her new position, she found herself thinking about him more than she should. They had meetings every few days, discussing strategies for improving patient care across the hospital network. Richard was demanding but fair, pushing her to think bigger, to challenge established systems. He listened to her ideas with genuine interest, often staying late after meetings to continue their conversations. One evening, 6 weeks into her new role, they were reviewing patient satisfaction surveys in his office, when Richard suddenly asked, "Have you eaten dinner?" Grace blinked, pulled from her focus on the spreadsheet before her. "What?" "Dinner," he repeated. "It's nearly 8 o'clock, and I just realized neither of us has eaten. There's a restaurant on the ground floor. Would you join me?" It wasn't a date, Grace told herself as they rode the elevator down. It was just 2 colleagues grabbing a meal. But when they were seated at a quiet corner table, the conversation flowing easily from work to more personal topics, she felt the dynamic shifting. Richard told her about building his first company, about the years of struggle before his first major success. Grace shared stories from nursing school, the patients who had shaped her understanding of what healthcare should be. They discovered a shared love of old movies and a mutual hatred of mushrooms. Richard laughed, actually laughed at one of her stories, and the sound transformed his entire face, making him look younger, less guarded. "I haven't done this in a long time," he admitted, as their plates were cleared away. "Just talked with someone like this. No agenda, no business strategy, just conversation." "You should do it more often," Grace said. "You're actually quite good at it when you're not being intimidating." "Am I intimidating?" he asked, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Terrifying," Grace confirmed. "At least you were during that first meeting. Now," she trailed off, not quite sure how to finish that sentence. "Now?" Richard prompted, his blue eyes intent on hers. Before Grace could answer, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression changed, becoming closed off again. "I'm sorry, I need to take this." He stood, stepping away from the table. Grace watched him pace near the windows, his body language tense. When he returned, the warmth from moments before had vanished, replaced by the cool businessman facade. "I apologize, but I need to cut this short," he said formally. "Something's come up that requires my attention." The shift was so abrupt, it left Grace reeling. "Of course," she managed. They rode the elevator back up in silence. Richard was checking his phone, his jaw tight. When they reached the executive floor, he walked her to her new office without a word. "Thank you for dinner," Grace said, confused by his sudden coldness. Richard nodded curtly. "We'll continue our discussion about the patient surveys tomorrow. Good night, Miss Montgomery." Miss Montgomery, not Grace. The formal address felt like a door slamming shut. Grace drove home troubled, replaying the evening in her mind. What had changed? What had that phone call been about, and why did it hurt so much to have Richard suddenly treat her like a stranger? She didn't know that the phone call had been from his head of security, informing him that someone from his past, someone dangerous, had just been released from prison and was looking for him. She didn't know that Richard had spent the last hour mentally calculating how to keep everyone in his life safe, including the young woman who had somehow become far more important to him than any employee should be, and she couldn't know that Richard was, at that very moment, standing in his empty apartment, staring at the city lights and trying to convince himself that distance was the only way to protect Grace from the complications of his life. The following week was torture. Richard was polite but distant in their meetings, never staying a minute longer than necessary, never asking personal questions. Grace threw herself into her work, developing new patient advocacy programs and training staff across all 5 hospitals, but the joy she'd initially felt in the position had dimmed. She missed the easy connection they'd shared that night at dinner, missed the version of Richard who had laughed at her stories and shared his own. Lucia noticed immediately when Grace visited her and Gabriel at the apartment Richard had secured for them. "What happened?" she asked, bouncing Gabriel gently as he fussed. "You and Richard. Something changed." "Nothing happened," Grace said, perhaps too quickly. "We're just professional colleagues, that's all we ever were." Lucia gave her a knowing look. "Grace, I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and I've seen the way you look at him. You're both being foolish." Before Grace could respond, there was a knock at the door. Lucia opened it to reveal Richard himself, looking haggard in a way Grace had never seen. His suit was rumpled, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his gaze landing on Grace with an expression she couldn't decipher. "I wanted to check on Gabriel. The pediatrician sent over his 1-month checkup results. He's perfect," Lucia said warmly, "growing like a weed. But Richard, you look terrible. When did you last sleep?" "I've been busy," he said evasively. His eyes kept drifting to Grace, then away, as if he couldn't help himself but was fighting the impulse. Lucia, with the boldness of someone who had survived far worse than an awkward social situation, placed Gabriel in Grace's arms and then physically pushed Richard toward the door. "You two need to talk. Gabriel and I are going for a walk. Don't leave until you've figured this out." She grabbed the baby carrier and was gone before either of them could protest. Silence filled the apartment. Grace stood holding Gabriel, who had finally settled into sleep, while Richard remained by the door, looking like he might bolt at any second. "Richard," Grace said quietly. "What's going on? Did I do something wrong?" "No," he said immediately. "God, no. You've been incredible. The work you're doing, it's exactly what I'd hoped for, and more. The patient satisfaction scores are already improving across the board." "Then why are you treating me like a stranger?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Grace had never seen from him. "Because I'm trying to be professional, trying to maintain appropriate boundaries." "Appropriate boundaries," Grace repeated, her voice sharper than intended. "Is that what that dinner was about? Testing boundaries?" "That dinner was a mistake," Richard said, but his tone lacked conviction. "I'm your employer, Grace. There's a power dynamic that makes anything beyond a professional relationship inappropriate. So you've decided what's appropriate for both of us." Grace felt anger rising, surprising in its intensity. "Without asking what I might want. What you want doesn't matter." Richard's voice rose, then immediately softened. "I don't mean it like that. I mean, Grace, you don't understand. 2 weeks ago I received information that someone from my past, someone I testified against years ago in a fraud case, was released from prison. He made threats before he was incarcerated. Serious threats. My security team has been monitoring the situation, and until we're certain there's no danger, I can't—" He stopped, struggling with the words. "I can't allow anyone close to me to become a target." Grace's anger dissolved, replaced by understanding. "So you pushed me away to protect me?" "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him something. "You've already sacrificed enough because of my family. I won't put you at risk again." "That's not your decision to make," Grace said firmly. She walked closer to him, still holding the sleeping Gabriel. "I'm not some damsel who needs protecting, Richard. I'm a grown woman who can assess risks and make her own choices." "You don't know what people like Vincent Caruso are capable of." "No, I don't," Grace interrupted. "But I know what I'm capable of. I know that I didn't take this job just for the salary or the title. I took it because I believed in what you were trying to build, because I saw past the intimidating billionaire facade to the man who cried holding his nephew, the man who spent weeks searching for a sister he'd never met, the man who valued character over credentials." She paused, her heart pounding. "The man I was falling for before he decided to play martyr." Richard stared at her, something cracking in his carefully controlled expression. "Grace, I've spent my whole life playing it safe," she continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. Doing the right thing, following the rules, being responsible. And you know what? The one time I broke the rules, the one time I risked everything for what felt right, it led me here. To this job, to Lucia and Gabriel, to you. I'm not going to let fear make my decisions anymore, mine or yours. You could get hurt, Richard said, but his resistance was weakening. The last update from my security team was inconclusive. Caruso hasn't made any moves yet, but... Life is risk, Grace said softly. I learned that the morning I met Lucia. Sometimes the most important things require us to step into uncertainty. She shifted Gabriel in her arms, the baby's tiny hand curling against her chest. Look at him. Lucia risked everything, her safety, her future, her life, to give him a chance. Are we really going to be less brave than a scared 19-year-old refugee? Something shifted in Richard's face. He stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of grey in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. I've spent 30 years building walls, he said quietly. Protecting myself, staying isolated. It's how I survived, how I succeeded. But then I found Lucia and those walls started cracking. And then I met you and... He reached out, his hand gently touching her face. And I realized that all my success, all my money, all my power, none of it matters if I'm alone. You're not alone, Grace whispered, not anymore. Richard kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as weeks of suppressed emotion poured into that single moment. Gabriel stirred between them, making a small sound of protest at being squished, and they broke apart, laughing. We probably shouldn't traumatize my nephew, Richard said, his voice lighter than Grace had ever heard it. Probably not, she agreed, feeling giddy and terrified and more alive than she'd felt in years. The door opened, and Lucia peeked in, taking in their close proximity and flushed faces with obvious satisfaction. So, she said innocently. Did you two figure things out? We're working on it, Richard said, but he was smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way that transformed his entire face. Over the following months, they did work on it. Richard's security team eventually confirmed that Vincent Caruso had moved to another state and was focused on rebuilding his own life, not seeking revenge. The threat dissolved, but the lesson remained. Life was too short and too precious to waste on fear. Grace continued to revolutionize patient care across the hospital network, implementing programs that became models for other institutions nationwide. Richard supported her work while gradually learning to balance his business empire with actual living, to let people in, to build relationships instead of just buildings. He and Lucia developed a deep sibling bond, with Richard embracing his role as uncle with unexpected enthusiasm. Gabriel's first word was Gace, his baby attempt at Grace's name, which made her cry and Richard laugh. On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 year after that first meeting in his office, Richard took Grace to the hospital where it had all begun. They stood in the emergency room entrance where she'd caught Lucia, where a single act of compassion had set everything in motion. I've been thinking, Richard said, taking both her hands in his, about what you said that day in Lucia's apartment. About the most important things requiring us to step into uncertainty. I remember, Grace said, her heart beginning to race. I'm not good at uncertainty, Richard admitted. I like control, plans, predictable outcomes, but you've taught me that the best things in life are the ones we can't control or predict. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. So I'm stepping into uncertainty again. Grace Montgomery, will you marry me? Grace looked at the ring, a simple, perfect solitaire, and then at the man holding it, the man who had been transformed by love just as she had been. She thought about the scared girl she'd been a year ago, worried about being late to her shift, never imagining that a single choice could change everything. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at once. Yes, absolutely yes. They were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the hospital chapel, with Lucia as maid of honor and Gabriel as the world's most adorable ring-bearer. Grace wore her grandmother's pearls and carried a bouquet of white roses. Richard cried during his vows, which he'd written himself, about how she'd saved more than just his sister that day. She'd saved him too. The local newspaper ran a story about the couple. Billionaire finds love after nurse saves his sister. But that wasn't quite right, Grace thought as she read it on their honeymoon. It wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about showing up, about choosing compassion over convenience, about having the courage to take risks for what mattered most. 2 years later, when Grace gave birth to their daughter, named Hope Lucia Hartman, Richard held the baby with the same wonder he'd shown holding Gabriel. And Grace, watching her husband cradle their child, remembered that moment in the emergency room when she'd made a choice that had seemed like an ending, but had actually been a beginning. She'd missed work to help a stranger, and a billionaire had come looking for her. But what she'd found was so much more than she'd lost. A family, a purpose, a love that had grown from a single moment of kindness into something that would last forever.